All right. We're going to start off in Proverbs chapter 14 this evening. Proverbs 14. We're going to finish up the topic, or the ones we've been looking at, on the idea of the mouth. And we looked at, obviously, the righteous mouth and then the wicked mouth. But there's also a lot within the book of Proverbs on not just on, well, say this or don't say that, but how we respond to the words that are being said to us. And really, that's the main thrust of all of the book of Proverbs. It's don't listen to the wicked, listen to the righteous, listen to, the whole first portion. He's saying, my son, just listen to the words that I have. And then the third admonition that goes along with that is that we have a responsibility as a hearer. A lot of times, and we're going to go through some of it, but when we talk about, the problem with gossip is somebody goes around and just says certain things. And that's really not the issue with gossip, because what you're going to find is that there's never not going to be somebody that is going to gossip. There's always going to be somebody that wants to talk. That's human nature, is to open the mouth and talk and all of that. But it's quite a few verses here in the book of Proverbs. We're going to start in Proverbs chapter 14, and we're going to look at, let's see here. I wrote down... it's verse 7, Proverbs chapter 14, verse 7. He says this, go from the presence of a foolish man when thou perceivest not in him the lips of knowledge. The responsibility, as we're going to look at in a number of different verses here, and some in the New Testament as well, that Paul outlines to Timothy, is that the responsibility, yes, there is a commandment that you should not be a talebearer, but more often than not through the book of Proverbs, it says that the responsibility is laid upon the hearer in the situation. That it's not even that it's our job to go around and correct, even though that there is some of that as we're going to look as we get further down. But the first point, if you will, is that the responsibility, our responsibility lies in that we have a choice as to what we listen to. We have a choice to what comes into our hearts and minds and what comes into our ears. And if you really think about that, because a lot of times, our first reaction is going to be, well, no, I have to. Well, no, you really don't. Unless somebody, in this last week was held down, hog-tied, and then earbuds forced into their ears, for 95% of the time, we have the decision on who we listen to. Now, if it's, most of the teenagers and whatnot aren't in here, and the little kids, but I mean, if it's your parent, then yeah, you don't have a choice. You got to listen. It's there. But what I'm talking about, and what he's saying here in Proverbs chapter 14, is that the responsibility is laid on us to have alertness to know who we're talking to. Have awareness of the person and what's being said, the tenor and the words of what's being said. And when we recognize, and we ought to be able to recognize, and when we recognize that the person or the conversation or the entertainment or whatever it is that we're listening to or hearing, when we perceive, when we have an awareness that's being made that there's not in him the lips of knowledge, there's not a right path, there's a connection with the idea of foolishness, which we looked at when we talked about the simple, the scorner, and the fool, that it's not our job to shut them up, it's our job to get away from them. And I think that's an important distinction to have. And look at 1 Timothy chapter 6. And this is not just, not just Old Testament Proverbs and, just kind of a cute saying that's there. Paul tells us in a couple different places, specifically we're going to look at two, one in 1 Timothy and one in 2 Timothy. It's 1 Timothy chapter 6. that there are some things that as Christians we ought to remove ourselves from. He says in 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 3, he says this, "If any man teach otherwise," and if you look at verses 1 and 2 of chapter 6, he is reminding them and telling Timothy that, listen, if you're a servant, then your job is to serve your master. And again, for us today, in today's society, there's not obviously the idea of servant and master or slave relationships with there. But what he's talking about is the idea of authority and submission. And that whatever that capacity happens to be, whether that's an employer, whether that's a governmental agency, whether that's whatever relationship or whatever is there, he says that the servant, those under submission, those under authority, should submit to those that are over them, the authority that's there, so that God and His doctrine is not blasphemed. And then he says this in verse 3, "If any man teach otherwise, and consent not to wholesome words, even the words of our Lord Jesus Christ, and to the doctrine which is according to godliness, he is proud, knowing nothing, but doting about questions and strifes of words, whereof cometh envy, strife, railings, evil surmisings, perverse disputings of men of corrupt minds, and destitute of the truth, supposing that gain is godliness." Look what he says, "From such withdraw thyself." Now think about this for a little bit, that as Christians, if you were to turn on any daytime news and or talk show, what you would get would be verse 3 to 5. I don't care which side of the aisle, I don't care which, thing that's out there, in some way, shape, or form. You know what it is? It's doting about questions. Strife of words, envy, railing, surmisings. I mean, it's easy to, pick on certain things one way or the other. When you go to like the doctor's office or the, someplace like that where you have to sit in a waiting room and they have, something on the TV, I always pray it's cartoons, but then you look at the cartoons and you're like, now I know why there's no hope for society because of the cartoons that are on today. They've always, kids' cartoons have always been dumb. But there's a difference between Roadrunner and Coyote and, Bugs Bunny and, Elmer Fudd and the idiocracy that is out there today for little kids to listen to. But one of the things that, it seriously makes me angry, and there's a lot of it that I can just kind of let go, is when you have, anybody, and I hope you don't, I would strongly not, consider watch The View. I mean, you are talking about, and it's hilarious to me, because now you have however many women that are on there, of all of these ethnicities and everything else, making millions of dollars talking about how everybody is so oppressed. And they're just like, it's like walking up to the chicken coop and all you hear is just cackling back and forth. And yet a large majority of people watch things like that. Watch daytime TV and the talk shows and all the things that go on, and of course, we would never watch that. Whatever your political affiliation or whatever it is there, if you watch almost anything or follow along with anything, even of a podcast mindset or YouTube or any of those sort of things, when you have a group of people and they get together and they're paid to talk, there is very rarely anything that you can talk about at length for hours a day. At some point, you have to find filler. And in doing that, it begins to fill up, and it very rarely fills up with anything that's good. It used to be, I remember watching having the 6 o'clock news or whatever, o'clock news it happened to be. And then every once in a while you could tell when it was a really slow news day, because then it would be like, oh, here's a story about a little boy that was selling, lemonade on the side of the road. Isn't he so cute? And they were just filling it in. And nowadays, it's one war and fight after another, or one person, involved in this scandal and all of what's back there. and you say, well, that's just the society in which we live, then our responsibility as Christians is this: withdraw yourself. Withdraw yourself. Is that if what is going to come of the words that you are listening to is envy, strife, railings, evil surmisings. You know what surmising is? Surmising is a rumination or a thought of coming up with evil things. And he says, perverse disputings of men of corrupt minds. Now listen, I'm a sports fan. I like certain sports, certain there. But you know what? It's an amazing thing to me that how even as Christians, we can kind of get behind four immoral men arguing about who's going to win the next championship game. No, I'm not trying to suck all the joy out of life. I'm taking Whoopi Goldberg from you. I'm taking, Charles Barkley or whoever else it happens to be from you. I'm not trying to remove all of it. But if at some point we don't stop and back up and really think about what's going on and what we're listening to on a regular basis, it will have an effect on us. And the responsibility is not on them. The responsibility, although I understand they have to give an account for the words that they say, but it's us as well. You realize that can even slip over into spiritual things. It's easy to point fingers at the left wing, yada yada yada, whatever's over here, or it's easy to to put out the womanizing, $1 million, people that are now off into, they can't play the sport anymore, but they're too in debt and all the baby mamas that they have to pay for, so now they have to get online and talk about it to make money or whatever else. It's easy to do all of that, but you realize it can just as much be a whole bunch of quote-unquote spiritual Christian people that all get together, and now it's just a constant argument that's back and forth. Well, I believe this. And you realize that the pinnacle of quote-unquote spirituality now is to get together and have everybody of differing viewpoints all get together and talk about something and give their viewpoint. You realize there's never a case in the Bible where that happens? Again, I'm not shooting for this isolationism or any of those sort of things, but it is what our society feeds upon, and what entertainment and those sort of things are feeding upon is constant strife and constant envy, constant railing. You realize there are entire entertainment social media channels that are based upon just picking out where everybody else is wrong all the time. And you know what? There's some truth within that, but if you listen to that constantly, you know what it does? It affects your spirit. It affects you in your Christian life. And the responsibility in the Scriptures is laid upon us as Christians, is that we are in charge of what goes in our ears. We are in charge of the things that enter. Look at 2 Timothy chapter 3. 2 Timothy chapter 3. He says, verse 5, it's kind of a whole thing and discussion of perilous times, and I find it very interesting that when the Bible describes a perilous time, he's not talking about whether Russia is going to continue to invade Ukraine, or whether China is going to provide Iran with whatever. There's none of that. He says covetous, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy, etc., etc. And then you drop down to verse 5. He says, having a form of godliness, but denying the power thereof. For of this sort are they which creep into houses and lead captive silly women laden with sins, led away with diverse lusts, ever learning and never able to come to the knowledge of the truth. You understand that from an internet standpoint, that there are 1,000 different people on the internet telling you how you should follow after and learn the Scriptures and do certain things certain ways, and in reality, most of it's junk. Again, not shooting for an isolationist mentality, or you can only ever, you only ever listen to me. No, I am saying, though, that our job is to make sure that what we're doing, just because it has a rubber stamp of quote-unquote spirituality, doesn't mean that we just, allow it in. We got to be careful about those things. We got to have alertness. He says this, verse 8, "Now as Jannes and Jambres withstood Moses," those were, according to what people would say, would be the magicians that went against Moses during the plagues. He says, "Withstood Moses, so do these also resist the truth. But they have a form of godliness. They're ever learning but never able to come to the knowledge of the truth." So they're seeking after something, seeking after quote-unquote truth, but yet they're resisting the truth. "Men of corrupt minds reprobate concerning the faith." He says, "But they shall proceed no further, for their folly is manifest unto all men, as also this was." Look at the end of, what was the verse? Verse 5, he says, "Having a form of godliness, but denying the power thereof, we should all get along together in evangelical unity." He says, "From such turn away." Turn away. Now again, I think you understand the attitude or the mindset is not constantly going around, and as soon as somebody says one wrong thing, that it's, "Oh, nope, you're wrong, you're a fool, cut you out of my life, I'm never gonna listen to you again." We understand that's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about somebody makes a mistake, and now, you're just, you're done, I can never listen to anything you ever say again. I'm saying this, that the responsibility is laid upon us to make sure that what we're listening to is both moral, it is right, it is edifying, it is productive, it is godly, it is truthful, and it has a right effect on us. Look at 2 Timothy chapter 2. We'll look at one more here in Timothy, and we'll go back to Proverbs. 2 Timothy chapter 2. You say, "Well, it's no big deal. It's just entertainment. It's just, just kind of fun and interesting to listen to." Well, look at verse 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 15. He says, "Study to show thyself approved unto God, a workman that needeth not to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. But shun profane and vain babblings." That's a pretty descriptive way of most of what's on entertainment. He says, "To shun profane and vain babblings, for they will increase unto more ungodliness, and their word will eat as doth a canker. Of whom is Hymenaeus and Philetus, who concerning the truth have erred, saying that the resurrection is past already, and overthrow the faith of some." He says the words that we listen to, be it spiritual quote-unquote Christianity words, be it wrong entertainment words, be it just things that we allow into our hearts and minds, if it's not the right thing, that it will have an effect. And he says, and it's a canker. It's a canker. That's an interesting word. The first definition of canker is that it's a tree disease. It's a tree disease that infects the bark, and it rots it from the inside, and the bark falls away from the tree. Most of us would probably know that more along the lines of a canker sore, a sore that gets into your mouth, and it's just sensitive, and it's weird, and it kind of just begins to eat away at the skin and around there, and eventually it starts sloughing off, and you say, well, that's just kind of weird. It's a very vivid thing. That when we allow the wrong word, the wrong person, the wrong thing to get into our hearts and minds, it doesn't take over everything right away. But it gets in and it affects and it begins to irritate. It begins to change the way you do things. When you have a canker sore, on either side of your cheek or even worse, on the side of your tongue. Get one of them weird sores right on the side of your tongue. Everything changes now. You don't chew the same way. You don't taste the same way. And all of that comes from one little spot in your mouth that comes in from whatever the bacteria or virus or whatever it is that comes in there. The disease that begins to ulcer, that begins to eat away at what is right. Go back to Proverbs chapter 19. And then we'll look at this one, and then we'll move on to a different topic here within this idea. Proverbs chapter 19. So he tells us to cease, or he tells us to go away from. In 1 and 2 Timothy, he tells us to separate from. In Proverbs chapter 19, verse 27, he says this, Proverbs chapter 19, verse 27, he says, "Cease, my son, to hear the instruction that causeth to err from the words of knowledge." Cease doesn't just mean you listen to it, but you don't follow it. Cease means you stop it. And going back to that same definition, or that same word of canker, is that comes in and begins a virus that begins to erode away at whatever is around there, or that disease that works its way into the bark of the tree and begins to rot that's underneath of it. And we have to be willing to look at the words that are around us and realize what is trash and what isn't. And when we can begin to see that, when we begin to recognize what is trash and what isn't, a great way of describing this verse is at sometimes, or I would say most times, you need to stop letting people dump trash in you. You know, sometimes it doesn't sound like trash. Sometimes it's a prayer request. Sometimes it's, I need help. Sometimes it's, I need, I just need a shoulder to cry on. Now listen, we all need support. We all need at times to be able to talk. We all need certain things. We are human and we need connection. You know what? But at some point, whining about a significant other doesn't help a situation. You know, you going to somebody else and be like, you can't believe what my wife just did, and she never takes this, and she never does that, and she never does that, and she always does this wrong, and she'll never cook my favorite meal, and man, she just doesn't respect me, and she just... Tell me how you telling your buddy that when you're playing basketball or whatever else it happens to be would help one iota with your relationship. You know what most of the time we want in that? We want confirmation bias. We want to say it, and then they look at us and be like, man, that's rough. Sorry, man. That's what we want out of it. We want to feel better about it. And what has to happen when we experience this, when things begin to come by and somebody, steps up and begins to say, well, I just really need to tell you something. Our first question or first thing shouldn't be, okay, yeah, shoot. It should be, am I going to be able to do anything with this situation? Is you telling me actually going to fix the situation? You say, what is that? He says, cease. Cease, my son, to hear the instruction that causeth to err from the words of knowledge. That sometimes we allow trash to be dumped into us or dumped into our kids or whatever else it happens to be, and the responsibility is not laid upon the responsibility is not laid upon the person. It's laid upon the hearer. Look at Proverbs chapter 26. Proverbs chapter 26. It says this, where no wood is, there the fire goeth out. We understand that, right? You don't put wood into the wood stove, the fire's going to go out. There's no fuel for the fire to burn. He says, where no wood is, there the fire goeth out. So where there is no talebearer, the strife ceaseth. As coals are to burning coals, and wood to fire, so is a contentious man to kindle strife. So what he's lining out here is that there's a wood that goes around, there's a talebearer that's going around, and it's stirring up strife, it's stirring up issues, it's stirring up coal, it's stirring up the wood that's there. And you say, well, how do you put a fire out? You put a fire out one of two ways. You remove the fuel or you remove the oxygen. If a fire doesn't have one of those two things, there can't be fire. And the responsibility is laid upon us that if gossip comes our way, it should be, the proper response is, I don't want to hear that. Go find, you shouldn't tell her, go find, to anybody, go tell, go find somebody else. But listen, I'm not the one to do that. And you know what will happen is if you have somebody that's trying to stir up strife, and they, after about 2 or 3 people tell them that, that, listen, I don't want to hear it, you know what magically happens? They go away. Because they're looking for somebody to stir this idea up, stir the coals up, and get a fire going. And the answer is this: don't give them any fuel. Don't give them the oxygen to be able to get the fire going, but that comes upon us. That's our responsibility. It's our responsibility. But you know what that does? That makes for an awkward interaction. That makes for an awkward thing, and unfortunately, our society has develop this mentality that somehow you are never allowed to say anything that would make somebody else uncomfortable. That I would never want to offend anybody. Listen, if somebody is gossiping to you, who cares whether you offend them or not? It needs to just be cut off. Look at Proverbs chapter 20. Proverbs chapter 20. But a lot of times it comes out in a flattering way. He says this, Proverbs chapter 20, verse 19. He says, "He that goeth about as a talebearer revealeth secrets. Therefore, meddle not with him that flattereth with his lips." You realize that most of the time, gossip doesn't start with the juicy bits. It starts with flattery to draw the person in. I just really need somebody to get this off my chest, and you seemed like just a very loving and kind and wonderful person. There's a guy in the Bible that got in real trouble because he listened to flattery. His name was Samson. Now, when I read the book of Samson, or the book of Judges, and read about Samson, I'm like, he's an idiot. I mean, how many times does the woman that you are involved with have to flatter you to get information and then immediately use that information against you the very next day? She had to have been very, very pretty. That's all I got to say, because that was just, or she had a great personality, one or the other. You know what I mean? Like there was something going on there, but every time she comes at him, it's with flattery, it's with manipulation, it's with this emotional thing that comes on, and he says, listen, you just don't even meddle with it. Don't even allow it to begin to stir up. It was that all those are just the first parts of that we have a responsibility to watch what goes into our hearts and minds. Look at Proverbs 25. A couple more. Proverbs chapter 25. You say, well, how am I supposed to do that? It's going to make it uncomfortable. It's going to make them feel bad. Good. I don't know why there's such this thing about, I don't ever want to make somebody feel bad. If you're doing wrong, you should feel bad. I don't know. That's just, at least that's what I think. But he says this in Proverbs chapter 25, verse 23. He says this: "The north wind driveth away rain." He says this: "So doth an angry countenance a backbiting tongue." You say, well, how can I say this thing in the nicest way possible? No. You say, what is the proper response to gossip? Anger. It says, "As the north wind driveth away rain, so doth an angry countenance a backbiting tongue." So somebody comes to you and begins to talk to you about somebody else, saying bad things, mean things, undermining things about somebody else. The proper response is anger, why would you come to me and say that? Why would you think that's appropriate? That shouldn't be said. Why don't you just go ahead and just stop right there where you're at? See what's that? I think that's a biblical response to the wrong voices that come into your hearts and minds. Most of the time when we have to sit in the doctor's office and I have to listen to what's up there, it's one of those where I just want to look at the TV and be like, you're an idiot. That's dumb. Why would you say, why is that? I think we as people have been programmed to never raise an objection. Never say anything. And again, I'm not talking about going around and constantly just, I think you understand that. But when it is something that is wrong coming into our hearts and minds, it is right and it is biblical to throw up the hands in anger and say, I don't want any part of it. Look at, here's a really good illustration. I was thinking about this, like, how can I illustrate this? If you've ever been in a household, or if you've had a dog, or you go over to somebody else's house and they have a dog, and you have a dog that jumps. What doesn't work is just ignoring the jumping dog. And what doesn't work is talking nicely to the jumping dog. You're kind of like, oh, that's nice, little guy, and there's just like following along, attacking you, what's there. And you say, well, how do you cure a jumping dog? If you're an animal rights person, just go ahead and plug your ears for a minute. You know how you cure a jumping dog? Wham! Oh, I would never use force. Then do whatever, get a squirt bottle or a rolled up newspaper, whatever it is that you do. Another really good one is as they come up to jump, you're just like, wham! Knee right there in the chest, and it sends them flying. You know what they learn real quick? Don't do that. And you think that's a pretty... Now, if somebody comes up to you, gossip, I would not suggest grabbing their face and kneeing him in the face. But metaphorically speaking, on a verbal kind of mindset, probably a pretty good thing to do. And you know what will happen is you only have to do that 1 or 2 times before you kind of get a reputation of, well, don't go to him because he's not going to listen anymore, or she's not going to put up with it anymore. You realize it's a protection thing. The more that you're willing to voice that objection, the less the opportunity tends to come into your heart and into your mind. And the last one, Proverbs chapter 23. This is kind of a 2-part. Keep your hand here in Proverbs chapter 26, but the last one is, one, it's a responsibility for us as the hearer to make sure that what comes into our heart and mind is right. The responsibility is to get away. The responsibility is at times to remove the fire, remove yourself. At times there is a sharp rebuke that needs to be said. And sometimes, look at Proverbs chapter 23, verse 9. It says this, "Speak not in the ears of a fool, for he will despise the wisdom of thy words." We're talking about just kind of third-party general admonitions about speaking. And it's kind of a separate thing that I just want to end with here tonight, is that, listen, not everyone, everything, and every situation needs an answer. Not every situation. If you still have Proverbs chapter 26, look at verse 4. He says this, "Answer not a fool according to his folly, lest thou also be like unto him." Verse 5 says, "Answer a fool unto his folly. Answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own conceits." We can go into all the reasons why, this time or that time. But you know what I believe the Bible makes pretty clear is that, sometimes the best course of action is just not to say anything. Again, this is kind of separate from the idea of gossip and talebearers and those sort of things. But I think just in general is that many times we feel the need to have to say something, to have to fill the void, to fill the silence, to give our instruction or our expertise or whatever else it happens to be, or to respond to a fool. I remember... It was quite a while ago, probably 10, 12 years ago at least. And, it was one of those things where it's like, I was reading on online, just doing research on a couple different things, and it was on a message board, kind of on scriptural sort of things. And you know what, I started typing, and they were espousing some wrong doctrine. I'm like, you know what? Like, I've got the answer, and you start furiously typing out this 16-paragraph, response that's going to prove all of the things wrong that they're doing, and you get into this big, long internet, argument over whatever else it happens to be, and you know what you come out of that? Profitless and angry. Profitless and angry. Most of the time, we don't need to answer something. Most of the time, the things that come in don't need to have an answer. A well-placed, pray for you. That's tough. I got to get going. We feel the need to jump in. We feel the need to put our opinion in. We feel the need to whatever else it happens to be. And he says in Proverbs chapter 26, verse 4, he says, listen, you don't answer a fool according to his folly, lest thou also be like unto him. You ever been in an argument and you would never do this, so it would be your spouse. Like, your spouse said something to you that they knew would purposely get you riled up. I know you would never do that, but we all have a spouse, but that would do that, or whatever else it happens to be. And you know what the best course of action at that time is? Nothing. Because even though you in your mind have the right answer, they didn't say that for an answer. They said it because they knew it would set you off. But then we feel like we just have to, so then it comes back, and now you're in the thick of it, and now it's 4 hours later, and you still don't even know what you're arguing about. But you just know that you're ticked off with each other, and you both know that you're right. You say, how do you break that cycle? Be quiet. Don't say anything. You say, well, what about verse 5? Lest he be wise in his own conceits. Well, that's a whole different situation, and we can probably talk more about that in the future. But I believe that for a large portion of our life, that we would do better if we said less. That if we didn't allow the wrong things to come into our hearts and minds and our ears, we controlled that flow of information. We pulled ourselves away from wrong sources, that we removed the opportunity for somebody to speak or to do those things within us. We answer correctly when somebody does, and then we just go ahead and default to an answer that says, I don't know. You say, what is that? That's a life that there's not a lot of trouble going on. You think back to every time you've been embroiled in any kind of extended trouble, and I guarantee you it's either one or both parties that the main source of contention was just all the words that have been said. Not even an actual action that's been done. And I believe our lives as Christians should be modeled after the Lord Jesus Christ. You say, well, Jesus stood on the mountaintop and he preached, and he preached Matthew 23, woe unto you scribes and Pharisees, and I understand that. He drove away an angry countenance. He had an angry countenance. It drove away. I get that. But you know what he also did? He stood in front of Pilate, and he stood in front of Annas and Caiaphas, and they brought witness after witness after witness after witness, and you know what he did? He opened not his mouth. He answered not a word. And so much so that Pilate looks at him and he marveled that he didn't answer back on those sort of things. And even when Pilate looks at him and begins to question him, Jesus very, very, in very few words, responds to it. And I think that's what we should strive for as Christians, is the use of our mouth well, the use of our words well. And so that's the last one on words. We're going to, Brother Bob's going to be covering for next week in youth camp while we're gone, and then we will pick back up in 2 weeks with another topic. All right, let's pray. Thank you, Lord, for the instruction that you give us, God, Lord, the vivid pictures that you paint for us in the book of Proverbs. And I pray, Lord, that we would not just use our mouth well, Lord, but we would use our ears well. That we would use and only allow the things that need to be said to come into our ears. We do that correctly. Thank you for your example. Thank you for your word. Thank you for your wisdom. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Amen. All right, let's take some prayer requests, and then we'll break off. Anybody have anything to add, update, change at all?